Well, it looks like the UAE may not be getting their F-35 fighter jets as soon as they thought. The U.S. State Department has just announced that it will be posing a temporary freeze on some Trump-era weapon sales. This includes the F-35 deal between the U.S. and the UAE in return for the Emiratis normalizing ties with Israel. Now, new Secretary of State Andrew Blinken says that the Biden administration supports Israel's newly formed ties in the Middle East and that reviewing all weapons deals is simply routine. Arms agreements with Saudi Arabia, though, have also been halted as the Biden administration reviews them. Now, joining us is Senior Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Bradley BOWMAN, to break this down for us from DC. So, Bradley, can you explain Biden reviewing Trump arms deals in the UAE, especially with the F-35s?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. A pleasure to join you. You know, it's fairly routine, as you said, and as the State Department said, at the beginning of a new administration to hit the pause button and to examine existing arms sales that are in progress, particularly those that the previous administration had finalized in the last few months, and to assess whether they're consistent with the new administration's interests and principles and with U.S. law. So in that respect, I think this is fairly routine. At the same time, I think we have to be honest that the Biden administration and the Democrat-controlled Senate and House are going to bring increased scrutiny to arms sales, particularly the UAE and particularly Saudi Arabia. But if I may, I think there's competing but manageable priorities here that the Biden administration will need to consider. One would be, as you said, the Abraham Accords. I mean, the Abraham Accords, in my view, were a historic and positive development. And peace should be its own reward, but I think it's in America's interest to demonstrate to the United Arab Emirates some of the rewards associated with that so they can, in turn, demonstrate to their own people the merits of making peace with Israel. And meanwhile, we have other countries looking on, deciding whether they want to follow suit in making peace with Israel, as the UAE and Bahrain have done. So we want to help them in that effort to encourage others to follow suit. At the same time, right, from an American perspective, in terms of our interests and our laws, we have to fully honor Israel's qualitative military edge. And you can't give the UAE the world's best fighter aircraft without affecting Israel's QME. So we have to monitor that closely as well. Yeah. We also have to make sure that the UAE will not let that technology leak to Moscow or Beijing.
Well, you know, with all of the business developments that we're seeing between the UAE and Israel, it would be hard to believe that this would necessarily, trigger kind of a backwards effect. But how likely is it that any of these deals will be significantly modified?
I think it's quite significant that some of the deals with Saudi Arabia would be held up or modified, and some with UAE as well. But I would just emphasize that, what the UAE, America, and Israel all have in common is a perception of the threat from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Mm-hmm. We want to have the most unified diplomatic front and the most capable military coalition as possible to push back on Iran and their aggression and their subversion. And so we want our Emirati partners to be capable, but we also have to, as I said, we have to monitor Israel's qualitative military edge. These things are difficult and sometimes competing, but it's manageable.
How have the UAE and other Middle Eastern countries responded to this pause?
The UAE ambassador to the United States is saying what he should be saying. He's saying, okay, this is a pause. We knew this was coming. But, if this delay extends for a period of time, I could see agitation growing, understandably, frankly, in Abu Dhabi. If you're just across the water from the Islamic Republic of Iran, you can be forgiven for emphasizing national security concerns. And UAE has wanted the F-35 for quite some time.
Now, in terms of U.S. Middle Eastern relations in general, should we expect any major departures from Trump?
I hope so. I think the Trump administration pursued foolish timeline-based withdrawals in Afghanistan and Iraq. We see the new administration, the new Secretary of Defense saying they're going to take a look at those. I hope they do that and stop timeline-based withdrawals, because I think any withdrawal that ignores interests on the ground and realities on the ground, the advice of commanders and persistent threats make America and our allies less safe. And so I hope they assess those and decide that it makes sense to retain U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan to prevent another 9/11 and a resurgence of the ISIS caliphate.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us and breaking that down. We're going to have to wait and see how this plays out, see if any serious modifications are made here by the United States.